never remember a thing when it's personal, but you got to write it down and you got to record it. And that's how you know about the past and what they thought. To me, I always looked at it as we're talking about time traveling through the language.
Hello, this is James Mirabello, producer at Spark Media, and welcome to The People's Recorder, the podcast that explores the work of the Federal Writers Project, the 1930s program that set out to document the United States and ended up creating its first national self-portrait. In this bonus episode, we have an interview with Gerald Hill, who provided the voice for Oneida WPA writer Oscar Archiquette in our recent episode about the Wisconsin Writers Project. Hill recently retired from his position as the president of the Indigenous Language Institute, so his work has relied on and honored recorded interviews with Indigenous people, including the work of the Oneida WPA writers. Hill had to read 7 or 8 quotes from Archiquette, and after each line, he offered valuable historical and cultural context, which we are excited to share with you. So in this episode, you'll hear Hill read Archiquette's words and then reflect on them. But before we do that, I do encourage you to listen to our episode about the Wisconsin Writers Project. That episode will give you some important context on what Hill is talking about here. Okay, that's it for now. Let me get out of the way so you can listen in.
I was born at a time when raspberries blossomed. My father's parents came from Oneida Castle, New York. My grandmother was a daughter of a chief. By 1920, I was on the bum. In February 1939, I was transferred to the Oneida Language Project. It is through this training that I'm able to write my own language. It's interesting historically, when they started this project here, there was kind of a internal discussion about who they would work with, because at that time, almost everybody spoke the language. So it was about jobs, because somebody was going to get paid to do this. And Oscar was a leader in the sense that he's a very outspoken man. And he was also regarded as the one that was most fluent in Oneida. Like when he said he was transferred, it kind of sounds like he was selected kind of like by consensus as Oscar's the one that could do it. But, he wasn't like the only speaker or even regarded as the best speaker. He was regarded as a very highly competent, talk with anybody, English, Oneida, whatever you wanted. He was there and he participated. So that was his personality.
I know he was a big part of when the Reorganization Act happened in 1934.
Yeah.
Really involved in that as well.
Well, he saw the value of recording the language, and he also saw the need to record as much as possible. So, like they trained him as kind of like a foreman of people that could quickly learn the new orthography, which they thought would take a couple years, which really only took a couple months. That was one of his ironic jokes, that, these people came in and thought it would take us years to learn it. And we had it, almost just like that.
Yeah.
There was people that were bilingual, and they were the ones that interviewed people that couldn't speak English. And I think that is the, really a treasure of what we have now and all those stories you were looking at. The value of that internal historical research through the indigenous culture that we have, using the recording of the linguistic analysis that had gone on, but not leaving it at the analytical part, but getting into the human part of it. I said, this is reflective of how people lived, what they thought was funny, what they ate, what they were thinking about the government. Why did we come here instead of someplace else? What was going on at that time? Because I had originally felt like, gee, it'd sure be nice if I could stumble onto somebody's journal that kind of like reflected all this stuff. And I said, I couldn't find one. And then I discovered this whole thing was one great big huge journal in a lot of different places in a lot of different pieces.
Journal of the People.
It is.
Yeah.
I married my wife in 1932. I thought maybe we would die of starvation since I had had a hard enough time to live while I was single. Well, it was hard times in 1932.
That was the worst year, I think, of the Depression.
Well, he was talking too about in one of his stories about going to work for a local township on the reservation that was controlled by white people. And he was criticizing how the jobs were like clearing fields was hard work and they were getting paid 50 cents a day. And, you know, he was more or less saying that white people got the easy jobs. There's a lot of racial animosity going on at that time about things like that. White people got the breaks and we got the shaft. And still they went ahead and did it. But he was outspoken in that way. You know, he could cut through the bullshit, you know, and say what was really going on. They liked him for that, although it didn't always make any difference. As far as I could see, he was doing it his whole life. You know, he was speaking up against treaties and speaking up against the federal government. And, you know, that was at a time when he was like the ultimate activist, you know, and he wasn't afraid to stand up and he wasn't intimidated by people or, you know, places. He was like, he said it the way it was. So he's, you know, valuable in that way. A lot of people knew about things that you just don't want to talk about. And that still goes on today, really. I was the first Indian to become a foreman on the WPA in 1934. Later, I was demoted because I shook a WPA official by the collar. In 1937, I was foreman again, but I lost that job too.
You know, I wonder if part of the reason he got demoted is because he was calling out some of the disparities that you were just mentioning.
Well, that was part of it, but he was also kind of a hothead. I mean, he was not above grabbing people or slapping people or getting physical too, especially he would have been a young man at that time, because he's got another story of when he went to the boarding school and somebody tried to discipline him and he slapped him or knocked him down and they sent him home. And, you know, it was kind of admiring that somebody had the guts to punch somebody, you know, it's like, but, you know, like when he was in that situation, he didn't hesitate, you know.
He would find a way.
Well, him grabbing somebody by the collar is very believable.
Yeah.
I could see that in the context of doing that job. It was somebody who couldn't handle him would say you're fired, but they still had to go back to him because he was like the main man. And, you know, it's like, you're fired, but I need you, you know, kind of a situation. And I think it was probably somebody else who was wanting to control him more than he wanted to be controlled.
Okay, it's James again. In this next line, Gerald Hill reads Archiquette's reflection about the Indian Reorganization Act. The Indian Reorganization Act was passed in 1934 and basically said that each tribe now had the autonomy to create a tribal council and govern their own community. Oscar Archiquette was a strong supporter of the Reorganization Act and spoke about it to the Oneida community.
I thought it was a good thing for my people, and I started talking about it to friends. Somebody called a meeting in a private home where I was called to explain about the law. The small log home where the meeting was held was back in the bush. I spoke in Oneida language all the way through, and when I finished, everybody applauded. Oscar was very good at understanding the implications of the white man's law. And so he could, kind of penetrate in a way that people understood both in Oneida and in English. So that this is the kind of the context of this line as I'm seeing it. When some official would come and speak in English, they were like lawyers, like talking about the law, they're talking about the Reorganization Act. And that was when they reformed the tribal government. I think that, it's like women complain about mansplaining. Well, Indians get tired about attorney-splaining or administrators or bureaucrats talking about, like this is going to be good for you, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think that Oscar was able to understand the intricacies of the law that would be beneficial to the people, but he did it in the Oneida language because that's what they understood better. There was a lot of controversy about whether we even wanted to make this kind of a change. I mean, there was a kind of a dichotomy of people that said this destroys the old way if we do this, and now we're puppets of the white man and stuff like that by doing this elective kind of a government. And it was like viewed as like this is a power play. You just want it because you're going to get advantage, et cetera, et cetera. And he was saying, no, look, he says it's going to be better because under the WPA, that's when they, had part of the New Deal that would help people build homes. They finally agreed to it and that it would be beneficial because we could get resources from the federal government to do things for the community. And even the WPA project was looked at, the language part of it was looked at as a way of using those resources to save our language. It's like writing or not, get it down the way it is and record it. And that was kind of like a big issue throughout the Indian country about, we don't ever want our language to be written down. And it would work if the language was not going to be lost, but they could see it was going to be lost. It was inevitable that, you can't live in another country without having an influence of that other language to the extent that our language would shift and the need for our old language would, die out. And I think that that's the value of this project, and that's what Oscar's vision of why this was important, like use their resources to help us survive.
It's James again. After the next one of Archiquette's lines, Hill and I discussed someone named Floyd Lonsberry. Lonsberry was a linguist who worked for the Writers Project in Wisconsin, and it was his idea to recruit Oneida writers to conduct interviews within the community.
One Oneida man stood up and said, "This cousin of mine has no business talking back here in the brush. He belongs in some big hall where he should talk about these good things he told us here tonight." Well, that's kind of an emotional sentence. Yeah, you could see that it was like this wasn't about what he could understand. This is about what we had to know with each other. So I would like to have been present, to hear that, because it was like, this is the intelligence and leadership of the community happening, in the time. So I think, that's what he was, kind of like reflecting and saying that, Oscar, more people need to hear about this, at the time, if you look back, I mean, I think the value of the stories, and as I studied, I have a degree in linguistics, and it was very helpful to me to go back to these stories, mainly because of the work that they had done. That's our connection. I says, we're trying to learn, and we really use the most inadequate understanding linguistically of what went on. So I always go back to the stories. I said, this is the way that people talk. This is the way they thought. This is the way, no matter what anybody says, if you're trying to learn a language one word at a time, you will never learn the language, or at least become fluent. And, hearing people talk and use the language and the phrases and the tones and the accents, I said, it's all there in the language because of people like Oscar, like, this is the way it sounds. This is what the emphasis is. This is the way people explain to one another. And I think that was, the way of hanging on. And I think that's the best thing we got to work with.
I think Lonsberry also realized that. I think that's why he wanted to work with people like Oscar also.
I agree with that. I mean, he worked on other languages as well, but, like looking at it, I said to myself, I said, I don't really care what other languages he worked with. He was like a brilliant man that had this insightful, analytical way and this personality able to recognize people like Oscar. They connected. And Oscar wasn't an educated man in a formal sense, but he was a knowledgeable man in the intelligent sense, like him and Lonsberry connected across time, because Lonsberry was like a graduate student, and they had taken the old orthography that existed before the one we use now, and he had kind of updated it like in 1940 or something like that. And they came up with a lot of linguistic analysis that really is kind of fascinating if you are a linguist, but it don't mean shit if you want to speak. I mean, it's like, grammarians can tell you the right way, but a good speaker, they kind of bypass all that stuff. And I think that there's, like these different levels of language and language meeting, and, that is fascinating if you're interested in that, but some people are not interested in that. And I think in a communal sense, you have everything. You have the good speakers or the orators, and then you have somebody that can explain, the nitty-gritty details of why this sounds better than that, or why this is better than that. I was one of the first to be contacted by linguist Floyd Lonsberry to help set up the vowels of our language. I was recommended because I speak both English and Oneida languages fluently. The linguist taught us the phonetic alphabet, which I mastered in 4 days. On the 5th day, I went out in the field writing stories in Oneida. I think that was, again, his kind of tongue-in-cheek humor about it. Something like, we're not as dumb as you think.
Right. What you were saying before, like they thought it was going to take years. He was like, I got this in 4 days.
Yeah, well, yeah, they gave 2 years for training, and they were like,
we got it.
Why?
Right.
So we're ready to go. It is through the first class training by Floyd Lonsberry at an Odsley that I'm able to write my own language. He is very ugly, but what keeps him down is that he knows us Indians scalp a person if they make us mad. That's funny. More humor from Oscar. He's a teasing man that's so insightful on different levels, of stereotyping and whatnot. He's teasing Lonsberry after he compliments it.
I also wonder if part of the humor for him was, for some of the people who might have some prejudiced or racial ideas, they weren't sure if he was joking or not. I wonder if that was something that Oscar thought was added another layer to the comedy for him.
Well, I think so. I mean, like that's part of teasing is like, whether or not, did you mean that? Like, what do you mean by that? Or so,
Right. Are you joking?
Yeah, or on the edge of saying, smile when you say that,
Right.
The Bible is translated into the Mohawk language, and from this the Oneidas wrote Indian songs or hymns, which they sing at a wake. When the speakers get through, just the singing takes place until just about daylight or dawn. That was kind of a reference back to death ceremony, where the condolence is that everything continues. And part of the continuity is that the people stay together. And, like, I think there's a misunderstanding of the function of how that went on. It was like changing from the old way to Christianity, and it was joining whatever the Christians felt by hymn singing. And they used the melodies of the hymns, and the words are not translated. It's like whatever the songs were, they're Christian in origin, but the context or the text is different. People would say, like, well, we don't want anything to do with Christians, or Christians did this to us. And I thought that that's too simple. That's not appreciating, the transition of how we continue to survive even through Christianity. Because I used to go to church just to listen to people talk, and they never talked about sermons or, like anything like that. They talked about what was going on. So that was more like community talk rather than preaching, about how we have to do this or that. And I said, well, the reality was that this is where the families go to see each other and talk with each other and eat with each other. And I see that as kind of a reflection in this last line.
And that makes sense also because, I mentioned that there's a few lines also from Ida Blackhawk, who was one of the other writers who worked with Oscar. And one of the bits that we want to use from her notebooks is about just that, about the community. And also there's some real pride in the fact that they built it.
Well, like the stone church is kind of like monumental, actually. You could just see like it was starting to fall apart, well, at different times, and it was rebuilt, and, it's still there. And I think it's, again, kind of falling into that we don't appreciate it enough, for what it is and what it represents. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful place, and it's full of history. And I think that, the social aspects of the church are reflected in the building.
In this final part of the interview, Hill reflects on his work at the Indigenous Language Institute and talks about the pieces of history he wants to explore next.
I used to be president of the Indigenous Language Institute, and I decided this year that I would retire from that. I mean, I'm a member of the board, and we do things to assist people or communities that are working on language revitalization, those kind of projects. And I had kind of decided that there was things I wanted to do on my own. I'm more interested in a human reflection of the response to the things that like governments do. Like when this land was allotted here, it's kind of like it was already allotted. It ain't going back, it's not like whatever existed before is now going to be brought back. It's like the past is the past, and it's important to know the history so we know what people went through instead of blaming, they should have did this and they could have did this, and if only, this or that. And I'm thinking, like, I don't want to whine about it, I want to say, like, people did what they had to do and now we're living with it. So, it isn't my mother's fault that I can't speak the language as perfectly as she didn't want to, even though she was a first language speaker. That was her outlook and her response to however she saw the world at that time. And I think that's how we all are. You're just born into it. Nobody asked you. Now that you're conscious, you can do with it what you will. And I'm thinking, like, that's what I want to do. I want to give insight to the importance of the history and also the philosophy of the culture as I see it. I'm not saying like this is the right way. I'm just saying this is how I see it. This is how it makes sense to me. And if it makes sense to me that way, I will just share it for whoever cares. I'm not going to say follow me and do what I do. I'm just saying this is what I see, and maybe it's interesting, to you. And if it is, use it. And if it ain't, do whatever you're doing, not to intrude and not to lead in any sense, only to say like, this is what I saw and this is how I saw it. And I can say, this is why I saw it. And if it's something that somebody can wise me up on, I'm open to listening to that too.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation with Gerald Hill. We also want to take a second to say thank you to Wisconsin Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting this episode. Thank you also to the Oneida Singers. It's their wonderful music you are hearing in the background. This episode was produced by Spark Media. Be sure to follow us on social media at People's Recorder. Thanks for listening.